Let me show you one of the most impressive sci-fi horror RPGs I've ever come across. It's called Across a Thousand Dead Worlds, crowdfunded and published in 2023 by Blackout Entertainment, written by an Alex T, and illustrated and designed by these folks here. At the time of this recording, you can get this game in PDF from DrivethRu. I'm not sure if or when a print on demand or an offset print of this 445-page RPG will be available, but in this video, I'll be walking through the PDF with you. In a nutshell, this game has three things going for it. The first is a whole bunch of fun, innovative game mechanics that keep you focused on the physical and psychological rigors of deep space exploration through the lens of horror. The second is that you get a bleak but focused gameplay cycle that is concentrated around one excursion at a time and gives you very specific gear and equipment loadouts. The third is that the book is absolutely jam-packed with tables and generators for creating an infinite variety of travel events, alien ruins and alien enemies, as well as NPCs and dozens of other aspects of the adventure. Every adventure starts off on Karam Station, a corporate-owned alien space station that was discovered in our very own solar system in about the year 2078. This corporation, Drake Industries, is not your friend, and I'll explain that in a minute. First, let's take a look at the sponsor for this video. Unleash your innermost monster hunter in a dark fantasy world steeped in folklore and cryptids. Welcome to the Dread of Night, a powered by the Apocalypse tabletop role-playing game that will take you on an unforgettable journey. Key features include inspired classes. Choose from 13 unique classes inspired by dark fantasy legends like Berserk, Dark Souls, Castlevania, and more. Each class offers a distinct playstyle, allowing you to embody your favorite monster hunting heroes. Gateway game. New to tabletop role-playing games? Fear not, the Dread of Night is your perfect gateway into the world of TTRPGs. Experience thrilling combat while enjoying the simplicity and accessibility of the PBTA paradigm. It's the ideal way to introduce your friends to the magic of tabletop gaming. Community engagement. Join their vibrant community where creativity knows no bounds. Plus, brace yourself for a year of excitement with free downloadable expansion packs featuring new classes, monsters, and modules. Support the creators directly by getting your copy at FabletopProductions.com. You can also find the Dread of Night on platforms like DrivethruRPG and Amazon. Okay, so like I was saying, Drake Industries is not your friend. Your character is signing up to become a contractual scavenger who lives on this station and goes on weeks-long excursions, not only using ancient alien coordinates that no one fully understands, but on alien spaceships. All this alien technology comes from what humanity refers to as a race called the Arsai, or Ancients. It appears that they peaked around 1.2 million years ago and then suddenly disappeared about 700,000 years ago. But all you're concerned with as a so-called deep diver is going on extremely precarious excursions on behalf of Drake Industries and recovering two kinds of assets: data crystals, and a certain kind of raw metal cube. We'll come back to the specifics of your mission and how things can go horribly wrong, but let's take a look at the mechanics of this game. You have 6 primary attributes, and they're mostly familiar: strength, dexterity, constitution, will, intelligence, and charisma. These start between 8 and 18, but check this out. When you make an attribute check, you actually roll a d20 and then add that result to the attribute being checked, and you succeed if the sum of those two is 20 or higher. That, by the way, is how your skill checks also work. Skills are rated from 0 to 15, and you have a total of 12 named skills on your character sheet. You also start with 1 talent, and you pick up a new talent each time you level up. None of these are superhuman abilities, and you can only have a maximum of 5. There are 50 talents to choose from here, or rather to acquire randomly with the roll of the dice. You choose from 1 of 10 backgrounds, each of which gives you a little skill boost. I thought these were really interesting because they really characterize the kind of setting you're in. You've got celebrity and hedge fund kid in here, but most of them have you coming from the dregs of society, mostly because of the fact that climate collapse back on Earth has created a sort of hellish corporate-owned dystopia, and most everyone is in the dregs at this point. So how do you get from Earth to this space station? Either by money, lottery, or cheating somehow. Your background and how you got here doesn't really matter anymore. Your character is only as good as their ability to conserve oxygen and supplies and avoid nasty alien encounters at this point. As far as leveling up, it's a very straightforward exchange. For every 1,000 Drake coins worth of valuables that you're able to haul back to the station, you get a level. It's as simple as that. Each level gives you a new talent. On even levels, you get a skill point to allocate, and every 3 levels gets you a core attribute point to allocate. Here's a good description of the game that I probably should have started with in this video. Across a Thousand Dead Worlds is a game of risk-taking, constant dread, a dash of boredom, coupled with stress, sheer violence, bright moments, and casual brutality. It is a game for exploring the insignificance of humanity, how its greed, wants, and desires come to bear in the face of a cold, unknowable universe. What's interesting about this description is how far the rules and trappings of the game actually make this true. Combat is based on a hex grid, so you know you're going to get all the war-gamey rules for line of sight, cover, area of effect, and all of that. I'm being a little hand-wavy about it, but the book actually takes the time to explain how combat mechanics work with a hex map. One interesting thing about the approach here is that the GM can instantly shape a combat scenario depending on where they put cover. Now, this is actually true of any tactical combat RPG. Cover is important, but the author here really emphasizes that fact by illustrating different cover scenarios. The digital version of this game, by the way, comes with a ton of supplemental sheets for tracking all kinds of things, including a blank hex map where you can establish cover zones as described in the book. One thing I thought might be almost too wargamey is the notion of randomly placing the enemies, PCs, and NPCs on the map. There's a system for doing this, at least, but the book later on also encourages you to change or throw out any rules or mechanics you don't like. It's not like we need permission by the author to do that, but I do think the game was written in a way that there are more rules than you really need. And as long as you're not obsessed with running a game rules as written, you can craft the exact version of Across a Thousand Dead Worlds that works for you. Anyway, there's a really important concept in combat called stamina. You can think of these as action points. You get 10 at the start of every turn, or 8 if you're in zero gravity. You use stamina points to take actions. This is a nice way of presenting action economy because you can mix and match offensive and defensive tactics in a huge variety of ways. You can also forfeit all stamina spends in order to move 2 hexes instead of 1 during your turn. Probably the most interesting thing about combat is the fact that anytime you or an enemy commits to a melee attack, the 2 parties roll their attack skill and modifiers against each other. In other words, melee attacks are always an opposed roll, so to speak. The attacker does get +2 on this roll, but if the defender wins the roll, they score a hit against the attacker. This is the default melee rule, so I guess it's probably best to try for ranged attacks in this game whenever possible. One aspect of combat that I'm a little ambivalent about is the enemy target acquisition table. You're supposed to roll on this table to see who an enemy attacks, but these options are completely isolated from the context of the battlefield itself. So an enemy could end up picking an obviously bad choice and get slaughtered. I'd probably chuck this table out the window and opt for a more tactical engagement as the GM. Hit locations are a thing in this game, and damage could be higher or lower depending on where a hit lands. Notice the quadruped, sextuped, and serpentine options here, because aliens. You can have armor that ignores incoming damage, as well as armor-penetrating weapons that ignore armor. There are a lot of more familiar concepts in the game as well. There's 5e style advantage and disadvantage, where you roll 2d20 instead of 1 and take the better or worse of the 2, respectively. And here you have critical hits and misses, where a natural rolled 20 will knock down or wound an enemy, and a natural 1 will trigger a random critical miss result described in these tables, depending on melee or ranged. Any wound that you take in battle that isn't your final fatal wound results in a roll on the injuries table. Most notably here is a 1, which will result in a random critical injury, and a 20, where all you lose is some gear or clothing. A 1 on the critical injuries table, and this is a D10 by the way, will result in the immediate loss of your character. Many of the others will knock 5 points off of one of your attributes. This here is definitely worth noting. If you don't want to mess with all the hex grid combat rules, there is essentially a 2-page alternative that uses 4 linear zones that sort of abstractly describes everyone's positions. This option right here speaks to a major feature of this game, and one of the reasons I call it a triumph. It really seems like the author has thought of everything. It's not just this little release valve on combat complexity. The sheer number of tables and generators later in the book is staggering. The whole game just seems very well conceived. Obviously, with a very complete game such as this, there are rules for stealth as well as conditions. Probably the most notable condition, at least as far as I'm concerned, is parasitic infection, which if your mind immediately goes to aliens, then yeah, that's the point. Mechanically, if you get infected, you have 1d20 hours before it gestates. If you can get back to the station, which is later described as a minimum of 168 hours away, then corporate doctors can save you. In other words, you will have to rely on field surgery, and that requires a success of 11 to 15 over 20. So basically, the thing's probably going to burst out of your body and your crew has to deal with one of these attacks. There's also more run-of-the-mill stuff like poison, radiation, and vacuum exposure. Stress is a huge component of the game, both in terms of its rules and its theme. As you can see from this non-exhaustive list, the GM is meant to dole out stress points in a variety of situations. There is just a constant trickle of stress foisted on players. At 3 stress, their nervous tick starts emerging. At 10 stress, they have to roll on a react negatively to stress table. 15 stress means -10 on all actions, which is actually really brutal. 20 stress permanently alters their character with some weird obsession or another, and they gain a point of trauma. Here are the different possibilities for reacting poorly to stress once you hit 10 points. They are described either while you're with others or alone. And here are those weird obsessions I was talking about. I always see tables like this in games with stress and madness mechanics, and I'm always a bit ambivalent about them because once a player starts accumulating these, they start to get hemmed in roleplay wise. I guess it's up to the player how much they want to actually lean into these, but take anger for example. It could get really tiresome if a player is expected to play an angry character all the time. Also, what if everyone in the party picks up one or more of these obsessions? It could just end up being an insufferable amount of annoying roleplay around the table. Fortunately, there are plenty of ways to burn off stress. As the GM, I would be generous about what alleviates stress. The end result of too much stress is trauma, which is determined by rolling on this table here. It's all pretty bad, but notice the 10% chance down here of rolling a constitution check against instant death. There is a whole other subsystem for mental health and status in this game called your emotional state. It's a spectrum, and certain triggers move you one way while other triggers move you the other way. The author says to ignore this entire mechanic when you first start playing this game and only incorporate it once you're comfortable with the basic rules. Okay, this is something that I found really fascinating about this game. As open-ended as it is in terms of how the GM generates travel enemies and environments, the way that each PC starts a session is really standardized. The idea is that your character always starts off at Karam Station, that corporate-owned space station that contains the alien ships. You choose either a known destination or an unknown one, with the drawback of a known destination being that you will find fewer artifacts and resources. Then you build your loadout and hit the stars. There are 3 different kinds of ships you can choose from, each with a different crew capacity, but that hardly matters. What is vitally important is your standardized loadout. You have a basic survival package and a personal crew package. You can also purchase more gear, but there are limits to what you can carry. One peculiar feature of your trip from station to destination is the fact that you never know how long it will take. From a game design perspective, it's a fun way to randomize the fortunes of the party and possibly leave them in dire straits before they even get to where they are heading because they might have depleted a lot of their resources. From an in-game perspective, this policy of sending volunteers out into space this recklessly just shows how much of a heartless corporation Drake Industries is. It's a dark setting. Travel is fraught and loaded with random events. Ship malfunctions and space anomalies leave players rolling skill checks to save their lives, and there's a very real chance that they don't even survive the trip there. Even arrival at the destination could result in a sudden destruction of the ship when you roll on this D100 arrival table. Check out this 2% chance right here, where you jump into the interior of a red giant. The idea is that the coordinates you got for this destination are so old that the star in the system has since died and expanded into a red giant. Oops. Tracking time in increments of 10 minutes or 1 hour is an important aspect of this game as well. You track time for various activities primarily because your crew only has so much oxygen, batteries, and maybe ammo if you're shooting. The clock is always ticking down on those resources. The actual nature of the ancient alien site can differ wildly, but as a baseline, they always have a non-toxic but extremely oxygen-poor atmosphere and a 1 in 5 chance of requiring a hazmat suit or more. And it's always 1.5 Gs of gravity. And here is a great alien site name generator. I'm not going to walk through every last tool in the book for how to generate an alien site, but it goes on for a couple dozen pages. When you roll on every table in this section, you end up with a fully fleshed out site complete with a mysterious history and a number of environmental threats and encounters. Encounters are the big deal at this stage of the play cycle, of course, and you have a pretty decent chance of running into something that will wipe you out. But again, the whole reason you're here is to get either these fungible RSI data crystals, alloy cubes, or maybe scavenged technology that you fill your gear slots with and resell back at the station if you ever make it home. Again, I'm not going to walk through all the great tables here that flesh out the encounter and discovery phase, but I do want to point out this pretty interesting table that details 10 different kinds of doors that you can encounter. This is a perfect example of how the game is so well focused on the theme of alien and unknown. There are just some strange doors in this table. Another theme in this game is dread and horror. You can see from this dread event table that is supposed to be rolled on from time to time that the adventures in this game are meant to be dark and scary. There is a whole chapter on generating the appearance and nature of a planet outside of the facility or site that you're exploring. It goes on for quite a few pages, but the overall idea is that any given planetary biome is comprised of 100 hexes. The game comes with this handy worksheet for GMs to plan and for players to map out what they discover as they plod through a landscape. There are travel rules for this mode of the game, of course, and rest assured, PCs have to fritter away their precious resources when making any kind of distance. This section goes on for dozens of pages, providing all kinds of random sites and occurrences based on the biome type. In the GM section, the author implores you to create scenarios that players can think their way out of, rather than create solutions to scenarios and nudge your players towards those solutions. This approach to gameplay is very much in the style of OSR, if you're into labels. This is another important feature of the game right here. Basically, the game is more of a session-by-session sandbox rather than a campaign-style RPG. You can create meanings and connections between sessions, but you're encouraged as the GM to create false leads and false connections between discoveries. I think the idea is to create an ever-deepening chasm of mystery for players. It's up to you, of course. It's worth noting that this game also dedicates a solid 30 pages or so to GM emulation, so that everyone at the table can play without a GM. The creature generator in this book is thorough and can generate a number of wildly varying creatures, but I have to say it was at this point that I realized that I would really want an online generator for this game. Between generating an exploration site, a planetary biome to explore, and a handful of new aliens to kill, there's a ton of dice rolling to do before a session. The fact that there are so many tables in this book that you can play this game for years without having the same experience twice is really great, but I've had a taste of what online generators can do and how much time they can save, and this game could really stand to use one. But yeah, generating an alien enemy in this game is great. You go through all these steps and get a really unique and interesting creature every time. They're either an RSI construct called a Guardian, which acts as a security guard at whichever site you're exploring, or they're a mutant called an aberration, or a synthetic life form, or local fauna that naturally occur, and they can range from the size of a rat to the size and weight of a gorilla or cow. This is a good table for showing you what kind of attacks you would be dealing with. Each of these is explained in a mercifully brief snippet. There are also psychic abilities if you're really unlucky. And the actual appearance of these creatures runs the gamut. Actually, you do run the risk of making a pretty ridiculous looking alien creature with these tables here, but you're not bound to your role or even these tables at all. These are just suggestions, and the rollability of the lists is just there in case you have a hard time making a choice. There is this whole giant chapter detailing Karam Station itself, which suggests that players will spend some amount of time here. The fact that you get a station security guard stat block means only one thing. Players will attack station security guards. But yeah, there are downtime activities if you're able to return to the station, and these result in all kinds of random results, mostly in the softer roleplay realm of things. There are a ton of weapons statted out in this game. I actually didn't see much mention of weapons earlier in the book, and I was wondering how exactly characters were going to fight and kill all these aliens. But rest assured, there are a good 3 or 4 dozen small and medium arms for PCs to get their hands on. Rare pistols like these are prohibitively expensive, but I think if I was running a one-shot, I'd probably throw some primo weapons like these at players. Expensive weapons are also a great way to bait players into dangerous situations, especially if you show them one of these tantalizing silhouettes. There's also a ton of gear and armor to choose from. If you want to talk about expensive, check out this experimental Dreadnought armor, which runs 50,000 Drake bucks. I think with an item like this, you're approaching the setting from a perspective different from the desperate blue-collar scavenger. This kind of armor, coupled with some expensive heavy weaponry, puts you more into the Colonial Marines category, which could be a lot of fun. Another thing I didn't see mentioned in the book before this is augmentations. There is definitely a cyberpunk vibe to this whole game when you start throwing in bio-enhancements like these, priced so high that characters are risking their lives just to afford them. But circling back to the Colonial Marines mode of play, you could potentially build up quite a powerful character in this game. As long as your supplies like oxygen and batteries last, you could really have a crew of alien killers going out there to smash things up. There's an even more powerful and essentially priceless tier of technology that may or may not be available to characters, and that's the so-called Vimanic tech. Based on RSI technology, you get a variety of tactical powers like ignoring knockdown hits and death blows, or instant partial cover, and in the case of running out of supplies, the chrysalid, which puts a character into suspended animation until they can arrive back at the station. Also great for parasitic infections. The sample scenario at the end of the book, Reigns of Felonious, written by Don Stroud, is a great template for a game session. If that name sounds familiar, that's the same brilliant mind that co-wrote both A Pound of Flesh and the Emmy Award-winning Dead Planet, both stone-cold classic adventure scenarios for Mothership. I'm not going to spoil Reigns of Felonious here, but it runs about 10 pages and is a great way to get your feet wet. The other sample scenario at the end of the book, Archive of Minds, is by LFOSR. It presents a longer, wordier scenario, but one that comes with more guidance and details about the alien environment and the encounters. So alright, here are my thoughts on Across a Thousand Dead Worlds. Needs an online generator. Like I mentioned earlier, I would be thrilled to see an online generator that incorporates the hundreds of awesome tables in this book. I do understand that by offering an online generator, it would probably need to be free, and that might hurt sales of the book since a lot of the magic of this game is in its tables. But for GMs, it could turn half an hour of prep into 30 seconds or a minute. Some sketchy artwork. I encountered a few places in the book, namely the ships and the named creatures, where the artwork looked like preliminary sketches or charcoal concept art. It just didn't vibe with the aesthetic of the rest of the book. Standardized character loadouts. This is a double-edged sword. The main drawback to this is that it can get repetitive and also detracts from the player's ability to devise their own loadouts in anticipation of problem solving. But standardized character loadouts are also a pro in that they simplify the process of jumping into a game and starting play. They also lend some weight to the whole in-world concept of a corporation processing volunteers and sending them out into space. There's nothing more corporate than a standard load of gear, and where anything extra just comes out of your corporate credit account, all in on function. Really, the most impressive thing about this game is the fact that it's chock full of tables for generating a dark and mysterious sci-fi horror experience. I'm a great admirer of Death in Space and the upcoming version of Mothership, but this book is absolutely loaded with tables that I can use to generate all aspects of the play cycle, from the travel events to the alien facility to the planet biome at large and the aliens that the players will face. And all the table entries are tightly focused on the dark theme of the game. Focused, fresh mechanics. The basic mechanics of rolling a d20 and adding your modifier in order to beat a 20 is cool, but the stress mechanic coupled with your emotional spectrum is where the rules really meet the setting in an important way. Your character is under a tremendous amount of psychological pressure, and you get the chance to play that out both in RP and on your character sheet. Worksheets. I really appreciate the inclusion of the worksheets provided for encounters tracking creatures, planetside biomes, voyages, and expeditions. Also included is a 3-page rules reference that summarizes all the game's rules pretty nicely without packing everything in with a 6-point font. Overall, Across a Thousand Dead Worlds is an orchestration of hundreds of little elements that come together to make the ultimate sci-fi horror RPG. It seems like in the OSR world, you have two kinds of games. Ones that ask you to imagine the world and the creatures for your players, and ones that give you all the tools to generate everything you need for the session. This is one of the latter, obviously. It's just a very complete package, beautifully and freshly presented with some unique mechanics and infinite possibilities. Well, by infinite, I still mean limited to you probably dying some horrible death when you run out of oxygen or get shredded by some nightmare alien with 10 eyes, your bag full of priceless alien artifacts spilling out all over the ground under the glare of a purple sun, and like your corpse, never to be touched again. That's all I've got for now. Links for this game as well as my Patreon and newsletter are below. Thanks for watching. See ya.